Thank you very much. So I am not going to show you any slides. I'm going to be brief because I realize that we are out of time, or we're getting towards the end of time, and also a roundtable should be an opportunity to address some questions to our participants. So I'm going to make 3 points. Let me start before that, though, by saying that as Andres said, these measures are old. I remember wrestling with some of the same measures that are being talked about when I was in graduate school working on my thesis. Now that is a long time ago. I mean, that's before mobile phones even existed. Um, to give you an idea of how long ago. And some of these measures that I was dealing with were even decades older than that, before we even had personal computers, right? They are old. Um, so they've been around a long time, and they're going to be around a long time because there's no denying the fact that we need them. So what can we all agree on? We need them. We've needed them for some time because they're an essential part of comparative research. We can also agree that they're all in many ways wrong. They are vast oversimplifications of things that are difficult. And that's what we're here to try to figure out. Our goal is to make them as least wrong as possible. That is always going to be controversial. So we will not always agree on the best measure, but we can try to hopefully agree on the dimensions of our disagreement. So let me make my 3 points. The first point is, let's not forget about measurement error. There's measurement error. We can talk about combining the indexes. We can talk about we creating indexes by combining elements, but every element in some fashion has measurement error, whether that's because of subjective human judgment or whether it's because of differences in national reporting, or in some cases, it's simply the fact that evidence manifests itself differentially. It was interesting to hear why the BTI is not working in Turkmenistan. I'm not sure if that was because of the application of the rater's judgment to the text, or whether that's because there's less text available. Some open societies will simply have more data if you're using text, for example, to analyze. Other societies might report things about aspects related to the press or to political prosecutions, for example, in very different ways according to definitions and their propensity to publish. There are also issues of granularity. So we have this trade-off between precision and error that's already been discussed very expertly in the presentations that we've had. What sort of scale do you want? There's a trade-off between trying to achieve a false, sometimes precision, which looks wonderful numerically, but is almost certainly off the mark. Do we think that we've just introduced a bit of noise, which is fine? All measures have noise, or are there components that would cause bias? But something that addresses and acknowledges measurement error, I think, is the only honest way to present that. Second point, there's a difference between what I call letting the experts decide and letting the data decide. This is similar to another area where I've done a lot of work, which is measuring a latent variable that represents left-right party positions. There are what my colleague Michael Laver and I call a priori methods, where we decide what the components are in advance, and ex post or a posteriori methods, to continue Latin. I guess that's Latin. Which is basically saying we've done a scaling and we're going to take the variables that correlate with certain outcomes or reduce to certain dimensions, and we're going to just call that left-right. Now, normally I prefer latent variable estimation in many cases, but sometimes it's critical to know what these components are and what the weights are, not from the data, but from a definition. Now, I've gone on record, I've written a book, which is my most cited piece of work actually, that says that for left-right party positions, the definition of left-right policy differs across contexts, because some countries don't have the same issues that are part of what defines left-right as a meaningful principal axis of competition that other countries would have. Do we want that for democracy? Or should democracy be something that we say, no, there is a standard called democracy, and we're going to measure that in each case? And we don't want to allow this concept to become really flexible over time and across space. That if you don't have, for example, free and fair elections, then you're not a democracy, and that there shouldn't be flexibility on this. I think that we probably all agree on that point. Now, we don't want a dictator to redefine what democracy is as being something where, well, in our democracy, we all agree in advance, and that's why we have 100% consensual voting. And we all know that that very argument has been made in some cases. So what's interesting, though, is that the data-driven approaches actually allow a better way to incorporate measurement error. Some of the Bayesian factor analysis and some of the scaling approaches actually offer direct ways to incorporate noise that is more difficult than these fixed approaches that allow components to vary according to the patterns that are found. And the last point I would say is, and this is something that is a personal preference of mine, but I always preferred, whether you're minimalist or whether you're more maximalist, and this is something that deals with the question of what are we trying to measure. And when I said we could agree on the components of on the axes where we disagree, I think a big one is to realize which of our choices about how to build the democracy index have to do with a minimalist versus maximalist definition. We don't all agree on what the scope of the definition of democracy should be. There are many different definitions of this, and Michael did a wonderful job of outlining these in his incredibly thorough presentation. For example, the BTI that we saw is about text-based evaluations that includes things like evaluating government success and failure. We heard about other measures that include things like satisfaction with democracy. You could even think that liberty itself, in the most minimalist definition, liberty itself is an outcome of democracy, not a core part of the definition of democracy. If you want to have an absolutely minimalist definition of democracy, it just simply has to do with the method of selecting the people who make policy, the people in government. So I would make a personal argument that we should be careful not to confuse outcomes with at least the components of democracy, because then it impairs our ability to see how variations in those components generate outcomes. If we build those into the definition, we lose that ability. So those are my 3 points. Hopefully you've been able to follow them without a visual aid. And I will now stop talking and let the roundtable begin its more interactive activity.